Oh, good evening, everyone. We are in the book of Job this evening, and we're going to look at Job 4 to 7. If you know Job, we have those introductory passages that we've already looked at. And then what we come to in the main body is there's like 3 cycles of arguments that come, where each of Job's friends get an opportunity to speak, and then Job answers them. So really, as we come into chapter 4, we're in the first cycle of those 3 that make up the main body, and the first one to speak is this man Eliphaz. If you remember, we had that picture of heaven and what was going on in heaven, and the question that was asked by the Satan of God, and then we had 7 days of silence in which Job sat on the ash heap outside the city. And his friends were there with him. And they mourned with him those 7 days. And last time, in chapter 3, we heard Job's lament. Job started to speak. And he spoke about how he was feeling about the whole situation. He spoke about the burden on his heart. He spoke about how he felt about what was going on. His desire for freedom, for death, for things to be different. And so Eliphaz comes up to speak after that particular thing. And it's interesting because I don't know if you picture it in your mind. When I picture it in my mind, I can almost see the 3 friends looking at each other, trying to work out who was going to speak first. I can imagine them saying, I know what I'm going to say, but are you going to speak first? Are you going to speak first? Are you going to speak first? And Eliphaz seems to be willing to step up to the plate, and he's going to talk to Job about the situation that he finds himself in. And what is interesting then is Eliphaz's theology, how he chooses to address Job's situation. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read through this and make some comments as we read through, try and sort of pick out the argument. And then there's sort of 3 main ideas, and we'll try and identify those at the end of each particular section. So the first is this, on the first slide, it's this: sin always leads to trouble. That is our normal experience. This is Eliphaz's argument towards Job. And it says this in Job chapter 4, verses 1 to 6. It says, Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? Yet who can keep from speaking? Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? So in this first little section, we have Eliphaz, and he's starting to speak. And it's almost as if he's shocked at what Job says. He's almost as if he's taken aback by the ferocity of Job's argument and the intensity of his feeling in this situation. And he approaches Job almost cautiously. He says, if one would venture a word with you, I'm going to talk to you. Don't get impatient with me. Don't be angry with me. Don't take it the wrong way. And he approaches Job like this. He says, you have instructed many. You have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. It's interesting. We get a little glimpse of who Job is here as a man of God, don't we? We get the picture of him as part of the community, and one who brings God's word to people who are in need and in difficulty and in stress. And Eliphaz knows that Job has been one who has been bringing the message of God and bringing the comfort to God, and he has been the one whom others have depended upon in order to lift them up. But what seems to be the point here, or Eliphaz's downfall here, is that he seems to not take into account what has actually happened to Job. It seems to me that even over those 7 days as he sat with the man and sat with him in his morning, he doesn't really understand the depth of the loss that Job has suffered, because do you notice what he says? He says, you have instructed many, you have strengthened the weak hands, your words have upheld the one who is stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? And what he seems to be saying in here is, you have helped other people in distressful situations. Now you're in a distressful situation. You should have confidence in God. You should know what it is to rely on God. But Job's situation is particularly unique, isn't it? We don't expect that disasters like this are befalling people from on every day, that Job has encountered people like this before. This is a really drastic thing that has happened to Job. And it seems to me right from the beginning, Eliphaz seems to fail to get a grasp of the depth of what's going on. And so he's speaking to Job as if he's just someone who says one thing and then doesn't live it out himself. He's almost hypocritical. He's almost saying, you help people and then you don't take seriously the same advice that you're given. And so he condemns Job in that way, right from the very beginning of his message. And then he goes on to say in verses 7 to 11, remember, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where was the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plough iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. The roar of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, the teeth of the young lions are broken. The strong lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered. This next little section in his argument says that, you're suffering, and you're not taking seriously the same advice you give to others. And now he's saying, and this is the normal way of life. Sin leads to trouble. Who that was innocent ever perished? The idea is that sin leads to judgment, leads to disaster in this life. If you don't follow God, then things are going to be trouble. Sow trouble and reap the same. It seems to be the argument. And he's saying that this is the normal thing in life. We know it to be true. There's not even a reason to question it. This is common sense. This is what everybody knows. And it's interesting, whenever you read this, sow trouble and reap the same, we're reminded, aren't we? We're reminded of Galatians 6 verse 7, do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. But it's not the same advice, is it? In Galatians, we're talking about investing in the Word of God, in the work of God. We're talking about giving yourself over to what God is doing. And we're talking about this idea where you get, if you put yourself into it, you'll get the same, you'll get better out of it, that you're investing in eternity and mean something. Eliphaz's argument is different. It's saying that if you live for God, then everything will be okay. And if you sin, well, then disaster is going to come. And Job, you have sinned. And that is why disaster has come. And so Eliphaz, right from the beginning, as he starts his argument, he seems to be putting the accusation on Job and saying, and his first instinct is says, sin is the problem, sin is the issue that's causing this thing to happen to you. And then he goes on to another section of his argument. Not only does sin always lead to trouble, that this is the way we know it to be, where we know life to be. But sin always leads to trouble. And he says, I have had a revelation. So read verse 12 to 21 that says this. Now a word was brought to me stealthily. My ear received the whisper of it. Amid thoughts from visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, dread came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face. The hair of my flesh stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence. Then I heard a voice. Can mortal man be right before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? Even in his servants he puts no trust, and his angels he charges with error. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed like the moth? Between morning and evening they are beaten to pieces. They perish forever without anyone regarding it. Is not their tent cord plucked up within them? So do they not die, and that without wisdom? So Eliphaz is creating his argument. He's saying this is, sin leads to trouble. That's the way it always has been. We know it to be true. And now he's saying, I have had a revelation. I have had this spiritual encounter, and I know it to be true because this is what the message came to me in the night whenever the Spirit visited me. It's a really fascinating thing because it's what we see in the era in so many churches where men are given responsibility and prophets are raised up, and these prophets give these great words to people, and people take it as if it's God speaking. And Eliphaz does the same. He's claiming authority here from his vision. He's claiming authority from some revelation that he has received. And this revelation he has received says that, can a man be pure before God? It says God doesn't even trust his servants, the angels. He charges them with her. How much is he going to blame the man or woman who's housed in flesh or made of clay, as it says here? He says he puts no trust in them, whose foundation is in the dust and who are crushed like the moth. And so Eliphaz is saying, listen, I know what human beings are like. This revelation from God has shown me that human beings are untrustworthy in the eyes of God. God knows, and He knows not to trust us human beings because there's none of us can get away without sin. And so that's his accusation, his beginning accusation against Job. Job is just like everybody else. He is a sinner, and therefore all of this catastrophe must have befallen him because of his sin. And in chapter 5 now, we hear his advice. We hear what he thinks Job should do in the face of this catastrophe. He says this, call now. Is anyone who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? Surely vexation kills the fool, and jealousy slays the simple. And I have seen the fool taking root, but suddenly I cursed his dwelling. His children are far from safety. They are crushed in the gate, and there is no one to deliver them. The hungry eat his harvest, and he takes it even out of thorns, and the thirsty pant after his wealth. For affliction does not come from the dust, nor does trouble sprout from the ground, but man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. So he says to Job, there is no one else you can turn to but God. You can't turn to any sort of supernatural intermediary. You can't turn to one of the holy ones. There's only God that you can actually approach here in this situation. You need to turn to Him. But do you notice? He brings an accusation, another accusation against Job. He says, I have seen the fool taking root, but suddenly I cursed his dwelling. His children are far from safety. They are crushed in the gate, and there is no one to deliver them. He's almost accusing Job of being the cause of his children's death. He is flying really near the wind of friendship. He is either being very brave with his accusations or very, very foolish, because he's saying, Job, you are this fool. And if a fool does what he does, then his children are far from safety. Then his harvest is at risk. Because, he says, affliction does not come from the dust. It doesn't come from nowhere. Trouble doesn't just spring up for no reason. Man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upwards. So Eliphaz here is very clearly saying to Job, listen, you need to turn to God. There's no one else you can turn to because you have done this. You have done this. And then he goes on to say in verses 8 to 16, as for me, I would seek God. And to God I would commit my cause, who does great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. He gives rain on the earth and sends water on the fields. He sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He frustrates the devices of the crafty so that their hands achieve no success. He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to a quick end. They meet with darkness in the daytime and grope at noontime as in the night. But he saves the needy from the sword of their mouth and from the hand of the mighty. So the poor have hope, and injustice shuts her mouth. Turn to God, he says. Why? Because God judges sinners. God brings disaster to those who sin. God brings down those who lift themselves up. God turns his back on those who turn their back on him. And he says here, and perhaps even his response to his suffering, suggesting that God will save him from the sword of Job's own mouth. He's even talking perhaps about the conversation that Job had, the lament that he gave, because he says he needs to be saved from his own mouth. He goes on. He says God will bless you if you repent. In verses 17 to 27, behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, despise not the discipline of the Almighty, for he wounds, but he winds up. He shatters, but his hands heal. He will deliver you from 6 troubles, and 7 no evil shall touch you. In famine he will redeem you from death, and in war from the power of the sword. You shall be hidden from the lash of the tongue, and shall not fear destruction when it comes. At destruction and famine you shall laugh, and shall not fear the beasts of the earth. For you shall be in league with the stones of the field, and the beasts of the field shall be at peace with you. You shall know that your tent is at peace, and you shall inspect your fold, and miss nothing. You shall know also that your offspring shall be many, and your descendants as the grass of the earth. You shall come to your grave in a ripe old age, like a sheaf gathered up in its season. Behold, this we have searched out. It is true. Hear and know it for your good. Again, Eliphaz says, turn to God. And then he gives this wonderful idyllic picture talking about the blessing that comes to those who follow God. If you love God, then life will be easy. If you love God, then you will be blessed. If you love God, then you will be saved from famine and from war and from destruction and from all of these things that will come against you. The only way to be rescued is to put your trust in God. Now, I don't know how you feel whenever you read those words of Eliphaz, because I know whenever I was reading it, I was thinking, Eliphaz says some really good things. He says wonderful things about God. He says wonderful things that you would recognize, and ideas that you would recognize, that you would share with other people if they came to you in a time of need. You would say, "Yeah, this is the way to trust in God, and God will bless you. You'll know His hand upon your life in that way." But the problem is, Eliphaz is saying good things, but he's answering the wrong question. Isn't he? He's answering the wrong question. Eliphaz has looked at Job and he says, here's a man who has sinned. And so he starts to give advice to him as if he is a sinner. He's saying, this is the natural way. You can admit it. You're a sinner because we all sin. You can talk about the revelation. Yes, I have a revelation that man sins and evil comes. And all of that. And we can understand that argument. But the problem is we have the first 2 chapters of the book of Job, and we know that Job is not a sinner. Not in this sense. He's not suffering because he's sinning. He's suffering because he is an upright man. He's suffering because he is a righteous man. He's suffering because God is boasting in him. And suddenly Eliphaz's argument, because it's applied in the wrong situation, it becomes the same argument that the Satan advanced in heaven. What did the Satan say? Job only follows you because you bless him. And Eliphaz says, follow God and he will bless you. The path to material riches, the path to success in life, the path to being successful in your business is to trust in God. And he grinds that argument in, this is the way things always is, this is the way we know it is, and this is supernatural. I have know of this because God has spoken it to me. Eliphaz has not considered what is going on. He has not listened to Job. He has not really taken into consideration all that has happened, or note of the character of Job, because he is so quick to point to sin, isn't he? It seems to me like he's just got this idea, sin is the issue. Therefore, he automatically goes into this argument without actually looking at the whole situation. And what we notice too is that even though he claims God's insight, we don't see him seeking God's insight. Even though he claims that he has had this vision of the night, that he has heard this word from above, that he's actually doesn't seem to seek God at all. Whenever I thought of this, I thought, I don't know if you've ever watched Question Time in Parliament, but it seems like that to me. Cammy Badenoch would ask Keir Starmer, how much pineapple did you eat for your breakfast? And Keir Starmer would then begin his answer, I'm not interested in how many voles are in the field, and I'm not going to talk about how many votes the Conservative parties have destroyed. You understand? He's talking about a completely different answer to a completely different question, and that's Eliphaz. And Eliphaz, accidentally, I assume, becomes one who is speaking the same argument as the Satan and trying to advance the Satan's agenda rather than God's. He's trying to put the idea forward that piety or holiness or godliness or faith is the path to material blessing. That seems to be what he's setting out, even as he talks to this man who's suffering so much. So once we get Eliphaz's argument, we come on to the second slide and we find Job's response to Eliphaz. And it helps us understand exactly what's going on here. So Job in chapter 6 is addressing Eliphaz and his other friends specifically. And basically Job says, you don't understand. Job knows enough to know that Eliphaz doesn't know what's going on in his situation. Eliphaz, despite all that time he spent with him, doesn't get what's going on. He says, first of all, in the first 7 verses, my suffering is real. And it says this, then Job answered and said, oh, that my vexation were weighed and all my calamity laid in the balances. For then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash. For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Does the wild donkey bray when he has grass, or the ox low over his fodder? Can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the juice of a mallow? My appetite refuses to touch them. They are as food that is loathsome to me. Job is suffering in such a way that Eliphaz hasn't even touched the very sides of what he is going through. Job's suffering is real, it's deep, it's full. And we know too that Job has been trying to understand what's going on in his life, because even here he says that he's been thinking about his words. He says, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash. And he's perhaps thinking about his lament. Maybe he's thinking, he's spoken too quick or spoken too forcefully. He's been trying to understand, and in doing so he said things, and then he's thinking back, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And Job is very aware that he could be sinning, that he could have sinned, that he could have done something wrong. But he has examined his heart, and he's examined who he is, and he can't find anything there. But there's frustration in Job, isn't there? There's frustration with Eliphaz, there's frustration with his friends, frustration that he can't communicate the full depth of his suffering to these people. And they have come to such a quick decision against him. He goes on to say in verses 8 to 13, oh, that I might have my request, and that God will fulfill my hope. That it would please God to crush me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. This would be my comfort. I would even exult in pain unsparing, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One. What is my strength that I should wait? And what is my end that I should be patient? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Have I any help in me when resource is driven from me? Job is suffering, and he is beyond his strength. He feels that he's being crushed under the weight of God's judgment, that he is being bowed down to the ground. And Eliphaz's accusations, and perhaps the other friend's accusations, are adding to God's judgment, adding to what is happening to him. Because he goes on and he blurts out that they have betrayed him. He says in verses 14 to 23, he who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. My brothers are treacherous as a torment bed, as torrential streams that pass away, which are dark with ice. And where the snow hides itself, when they melt, they disappear. When it is hot, they vanish from their place. The caravans turn aside from their course. They go up into the waste and perish. The caravans of Tema look. The travellers of Sheba hope. They are ashamed because they were confident. They come here and were disappointed. For you have now become nothing. You see my calamity and are afraid. Have I said, make me a gift? Or from your wealth offer a bribe for me? Or deliver me from my adversary's hand? Or redeem me from the hand of the ruthless? He looks at these men. He looks at these men who have supposedly come to comfort him, who have supposedly come to stand with him in his hour of need, and yet they are a barrier. They are a trouble to him. They are adding to his suffering. He talks about the caravans, the caravan traders going through the desert, and he talks about them going to a riverbed, and they're anticipating the riverbed. They're sure that the river's there, that there's going to be water at the next stop, that they're going to go there, they're going to find it. But these men, Eliphaz, are like a river that has dried up when the caravan arrives, and suddenly everybody's going thirsty. These men are leaving Job thirsty because they have no guidance, no help for this situation. When he listens to Eliphaz's words, he hears someone who is bringing nothing to him, and he's saying here, what have I asked you for? Have I told you to make me a gift or offer me a bribe? Haven't asked you for any of this, and you've just come along and you've just made my situation far worse than ever it was. And then he challenges him. Show me my sin. Verses 24 to 30. Teach me, and I will be silent. Make me understand how I have gone astray. How forceful are upright words, but what does reproof from you reprove? Do you think that you can reprove words when the speech of a despairing man is wind? You would even cast lots over the fatherless and bargain over your friend. But now be pleased to look at me, for I will not lie to your face. Please turn, let no injustice be done. Turn now, my vindication is at stake. Is there any injustice on my tongue? Cannot my palate discern the cause of calamity? What does he say to them? Teach me. Make me understand. Show me. Examine my words. He's saying, listen, you're accusing me of being a sinner. You're accusing me of just being like everybody else and going against God. You're telling me that you have some supernatural insight into the wickedness of my life, and that because of my wickedness I have caused the death of my family. Well, point the sin out, since you're so smart. Point it out. Show me. It's easy to say everybody's a sinner. It's easy to say you've sinned. But point it out. Where have you seen me do wickedness? Where have you seen me? Where have you heard me speak a word that is wrong or not as against God? He says, I have kept the words of God. Friends, do you see what's happening here? Here's Job and he's suffering. But he's no fool. He's one who knows what's what. And he knows what the argument is. And he is not willing to to just listen to that argument and let it damage him further than it already has. Job has examined his heart. Job has looked inside. He spent all of those days under the hand of God, and he has been thinking and seeking to understand what's going on. And then these boys just arrive and start pointing the finger and say, you're a sinner. They don't comprehend the depth of his suffering. They have not come to help. They're instead making it worse. They accuse him of sin, but they can point to nothing that would justify God's actions. And they warn him not to talk the way he's talking or express how he really feels to God. Eliphaz has come with this really eloquent speech. He's come with this assurance that he understands the situation. And By the way, Eliphaz the Temanite, the Temanites were renowned for their oratory, for their wisdom, and they were people who prided themselves on the way they could put an argument together. And Eliphaz has come with this wonderful argument. This wonderful argument that it would help a person who was dealing with sin in their lives. But it has nothing to do with Job. It has nothing to do with Job at all. Eliphaz and his friends are of no help to him. And Job knows it. And so Job does what any good believer will do. He then turns to God. And he turns to God and he says, why have I become a burden to you? Job chapter 7 says, Has not man a hard service on earth? And are not his days like the days of a hired hand? Like a slave who longs for the shadow, and like a hired hand who looks for his wages. So I am allotted months of emptiness, and nights of misery are appointed to me. When I lie down, when I say, when shall I arise? But the night is long, and I toss and turn till dawn. My flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. My skin hardens, then breaks out afresh. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and come to their end without hope. Remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never again see good. The eye of him who sees me will behold me no more. While your eyes are on me, I shall be gone. As the cloud fades and vanishes, he who goes down to Sheol does not come up. He returns no more to his house, nor does his place know him anymore. Job's trying again to speak to God. He's gone to his master, he's gone to his Lord, and he's struggling. You know, he's talking about he wants his life to end, but he's also concerned that his days are running out. We can see how we're like in trouble. You know the way when trouble comes to your life and you're talking to God, and sometimes you're saying contradictory things. You'll say one thing in one sentence and you say the opposite in the next and think you're making sense. And it seems to be that's what Job's doing. He wants the end of his life, but his life is running out like a weaver's shuttle. He's looking to the future, but then there's nothing ahead but emptiness. He thinks of Sheol and the end of everything. And then all he can do is cry out for reprieve. Therefore I will not restrain my mouth. He won't do what Eliphaz and all tells him to do. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or a sea monster that you set a guard over me? When I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions, so that I would choose strangling and death rather than my bones. I loathe my life. I would not live forever. Leave me alone. For my days are a breath. What is man that you make so much of him, and that you set your heart on him? Visit him every morning and test him every moment. How long will you not look away from me, or leave me alone till I swallow my spit? If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I shall lie in the earth. You will seek me, but I shall not be. Job's hopeless, isn't he? He's speaking his mind to God. He's determined to do it. But he feels like he's a monster that God's trying to control. He's wondering why the morning comes. Why he has to bear through this whenever God seems to be against him. There is real hardship in his life. And even God's presence is a hardship for him. You ever been there? Where the very presence of God is a difficult place to be. He says, why do you make much of me? Why do you set your heart on me? Why do you visit me every morning? Why do you test me every morning? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? And there's a whole mix there, isn't there? There's a mix of things which you could say, God, why do you love me? And then why do you make me your mark? Why do you visit me every in the morning? But then why have I become a burden to you? He says, why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? He's confessed his sin. Again, you get this glimpse of Job that he's been confessing his sin. He's like one of those men under torture. It gets so bad that they'll confess to absolutely anything just to end the suffering. And Job seems to be going through his life and thinking of any little thing and saying, I'm going to confess that, I'm going to confess that, I'm going to confess that. Lord, why will you just not forgive me? Because that's who you do. You forgive iniquity. But nothing seems to change the situation. Job is in a desperate place. But that's the whole point, isn't it? Job was innocent. He was not suffering because of his sin. He was suffering because he was God's pride, because God took delight in him. And the problem is, well, we learn at least 3 lessons from this. First of all, we learn that God's words can be applied wrongly and become the wrong words. God's word can be applied wrongly and become the wrong words. Whenever we apply God's words to different situations, if we apply them wrong, we can turn the meaning around and make them of no effect, or make them worse than that, make them hurt folk. Because that's what Eliphaz does. He gives good things that we know to be true from God, and yet his application to Job is wrong, and he makes Job suffer more because of the things that he's saying. It's a dangerous thing. We need to be careful when we give advice, and we need to be careful from those whom we receive advice, that they know what the situation is, because sometimes they can get it so wrong, and sometimes that makes things so much worse. The second thing I think we see is God's presence is always best. Because whenever Eliphaz is finished and Job has finished talking to Eliphaz, he does the best thing possible. He goes into God's presence, and he goes and he speaks to God as he did before. I think this is a wonderful thought, because friends are wonderful. I think it's good to have friends that you can talk to. It's good to have family. It's good to have colleagues, professionals. Even pastors are great if you want someone to share your situation with. But there's no one knows your heart or your situation like God does. There's no one you can be as open and honest with but God. He is the one whom you can tell everything to. And his word is the measuring stick, and you know you're on the right path. And friends, whenever we're in trouble, whenever we're in distress, whenever we don't know what's going on, God's presence is the best place to be. But that's the third lesson, I think. God's presence is not always comfortable. I'm sure you've noticed that over the years. Sometimes slipping into God's presence is easy, isn't it? Time is sweet spent with God when you're maybe at home and you're singing and you're praying and you're reading God's word, and it's just going so lovely, and you're just spending time with God, and it sets you up for the day, or sets you up from the situation you're going, and you're just going, this is just fantastic, isn't it? But then there are those days, and they are many, when you go into God's presence and it's hard going. The Bible seems to be closed. You can't understand a word of it. Sometimes when I'm going to read, it's almost as if the words are dancing around the page. They just don't seem to make sense. Words that I know so well, and yet they don't make sense. Where prayer is hard, where you don't even know what to say. You're bowed before your God, and you know that you need to talk to him about the situation, but you just can't articulate it in any way, shape, or form. When there's no joy, no desire to sing, no joy, no desire to raise your voice in praise, and everything seems to be forced. We assume in those moments that God is not there, that God's not listening, but it can often be that God's presence is just a difficult place to be in. Sometimes it's hard to be where God is, because of what's going on in our lives, because of our own thoughts and our own thinking, and because we're so torn up by the situation we find ourselves in. And yet it is the best place to be, even in difficulty, even when the heavens are like brass, as some people will say. It is still the best place to be, because even in the silence, even in the confusion, even in the hardship, knowing God is there and resting in the fact that God is there can be the very thing that we need. So folks, whenever we look at through these accusations made against Job, I think there's wonderful things that Job brings out for us to help us to navigate the life that we live. But they're so easy to miss at times because of the complexity of the argument. But if we rest in who God is and trust him, then we'll know that he knows the way for us. Even when we leave his presence confused, maybe even more confused than when we entered it, it is still the best place that we have been, and the one where we will get the answer that we need to know. Amen.